Hi, everybody. I'm Jim Fossil, weekly columnist for the Portland Press Herald, Maine Sunday Telegram. I also have a Substack where I write about politics, sports, and a few other topics. I'll put links to both in the description below. Now, if you follow my writings, you probably noticed that I haven't written that much about anything President Trump has done since coming back into office on January 20th. There's a very good reason for that. He's been doing a lot, very quickly, and I don't have time to catch it all with the column. See, the column appears in print on Sunday. My deadline is several days before. Now, with the Substack, I can publish instantly, but I also don't have time to sit around, watch the news, and then write about it all day. I have other things to do. So, with everything that's happened over the past month, I thought it'd be a good time to do my first video. I have the chance tonight to talk with a good friend of mine, Professor Douglas Mock. Professor Mock is a professor of political science, constitutional law, at Morehead State University in Kentucky. We're going to discuss tonight not the politics of everything that Trump is doing, but the legal aspects and how it could affect future presidents and the country going forward. So I should say to everybody that we're recording this on Tuesday night. So, if Trump invades Greenland by the end of the week or something, we won't be talking about that. But I just want to talk with you, Doug, about everything that's been going on for the first month of the administration so far and where things stand, legally and constitutionally in a historical context.
Well, one thing Trump has done in common with recent presidents, I really date this from the Obama administration. You had executive order. He's ruled by executive order, right? And you had certainly executive orders have a long pedigree in U.S. government, but the quality of executive orders has changed in the last 15 or so years since the onset of the Obama administration. And this is the way presidents try to do things now. So Trump isn't in that regard, I think, any different from Obama, who did major revisions to our immigration policy via executive order, or than he was in the first Trump administration, or President Biden, who tried, for example, to get everybody vaccinated through executive order
and cancel student debt.
Yeah. So this business of, well, Congress is dysfunctional and there's too much polarization, so the president has a phone and a pen, to paraphrase President Obama in one of his State of the Union addresses. This has become a sort of constitutionally suspect way of doing things. I'm not sure it's a healthy way of doing things. I'm pretty sure it's not what the drafters of the Constitution have in mind, but Trump and other recent presidents have taken advantage of the fact that there's sort of a gray area between, well, when are you faithfully executing the law, or when are you sort of inventing your own law because you don't like what the legislative body, the Congress, has done.
Yeah, and I think with every president of my lifetime, it's gotten successfully worse and more intense every term.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree with that, and it's kind of like the genie's out of the bottle. We don't even pretend that presidents are going to accomplish their goals by working with Congress and compromising with Congress. I think, this idea that's, I don't know if it's a symptom of or a cause of political polarization, but this idea that, and you see it on both sides of the political aisle, that compromise is a dirty word, and that you can't give an inch to the other side, is partly what's driving this. Because, of course, doing things by legislation, that's compromise. I mean, that's what legislation is, right? That's give and take, unless you have super majorities, which nobody does anymore.
And it's even compromising within your own party.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so to the extent, and I know, Trump has a lot of fans that are very enthused about the first, what is it now, almost 30 days. But with the exception of one piece of legislation, it's all done by executive order. A lot of this has already gone to the courts, but none of it has gone beyond the trial court level, the federal district court level. None of it's gone beyond injunction. I'm a little bit afraid that we're going to see 4 years of litigation, much like we did, both in the first Trump administration and in the Biden administration. And you've
Oh,
had a
right.
lot
And
of Supreme. Go ahead.
sorry, I was going to say, I've noticed in the past week a lot of commentators throwing around the term constitutional crisis just because so many things are being challenged at once and happening at once. But it's really just a matter of volume than it is anything unique, right?
Yeah, that's right. I don't see any constitutional crisis here, largely because, to his credit, or at least in my view, not everybody would agree with me that this is to his credit, not least some of his own supporters. But to his credit, he has said that he intends to go through the courts, that he will comply with court orders, and that he will honor the legal process. And that has not always been a given in American constitutional history. You've had presidents, not recently, but you've had presidents that have openly defied court orders. You've had presidents who indicated a willingness to defy court orders. So President Trump has not, at least yet, gone that far.
And even
In
that is not
fact,
president.
I would make the argument that uh, if any recent president has blatantly ignored court orders, it was President Biden, uh, who, who essentially, when he was told over and over again by the judicial system that he didn't have the authority to do what he did with respect to forgiveness of student loans, said, "Well, he's going to do it anyway," uh, and kept attempting it. But I don't see a constitutional crisis, not at this point.
I mean, he tried to find workarounds around the orders the same way that Trump did with the first travel ban. He kept trying to rework it through until it got.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that question, Jim, kind of reflects how this idea of faithfully executing the law has changed in 230 some odd years since the Constitutional Convention. I mean, that's what the president does. People forget that. At least constitutionally, the president is not a lawmaker, except to the extent that he can bring pressure to bear because of the veto. Obviously
And
the
the
veto.
legislature is first for a reason.
Right. The legislature, the Congress is in Article 1 for a reason. Presidents are supposed to faithfully execute the laws. Now, you can, and recent administrations have made sort of creative legal arguments that by appearing to defy the law or seeking workarounds to what the courts have said the law is, that they're actually faithfully executing the law. I don't know that I've always found that persuasive. I mean, we've kind of reached the stage where we expect our students, excuse me, I had my students on my mind. we expect our
That's your job.
presidents to do things. I was just going to make the point, and this is why the word students came out. Um, that in my introductory political science classes, and even with upper level political science students who are studying law, uh, uh, they are almost startled when I question whether the president has the authority to do something. I mean, this is almost a new concept to them. That, well, wait, there are limits on the president's power. Really, he's supposed to execute the law and not be the lawmaker.
Yeah,
Uh,
well,
uh,
I was in college, 20 years ago now, more than 20 years ago now.
yeah.
It was during right when 9/11 happened, and I took, was political science major, took common law classes, and was taught that yes, there are things the president can and cannot do, and that was very clear.
Right.
But now, so you're saying that's sort of gone by the wayside now in education as a
It
concept?
has. Yeah, yes, it has. And young people today, and it's not just young people, I don't think really understand what the nature of executive orders is.
Yeah.
We've had them since Washington, right? Every president has issued executive orders, but the question is, when do they become legislative in character? When do they sort of become programmatic decisions that apply to large classes of people that take on the characteristics of legislation rather than they do of the president as the head of the executive branch of the federal government issuing orders to his subordinate employees. So when President Obama, for example, implemented DACA, which I alluded to a few moments ago, that he essentially revamped our immigration system. I don't think people understand that's done essentially by directing ICE agents, by directing U.S. attorneys not to prosecute certain kinds of cases, and it's done sort of as an across the board policy with respect to DACA, which President Obama did not call an executive order. It was not published as an
Right.
executive order. It was a memorandum, right? Now that is something that I know the founders would not have approved of, right? Government by cabinet secretary memorandum. It was Secretary Napolitano in that case, fundamentally altering, a major government policy. But it was to say, for example, that we're not going to enforce immigration law against people that came here as children who have been here for a certain period of time and have remained relatively crime free, and this
And
will
look,
apply across the board.
I mean, I understand prosecutorial discretion and that the federal government can do that as well as the state and local government. You don't have to pull over every speeder or arrest every single person doing jaywalking. But there's a difference between using discretion and just implementing a blanket new policy nationwide.
Right. You just raised the relevant question. And you will notice that phrase prosecutorial discretion is not being used anymore because it was used in such an Orwellian sense when President Obama first implemented DACA. That was his justification, prosecutorial discretion. But if you look, and you're absolutely right, courts have made it clear correctly, necessarily, because there's really no other way to do it, that it is an executive function. It is an executive prerogative to decide on cases that are going to be prosecuted, to sort of prioritize that sort of thing. But those same cases have also made it clear that that's supposed to represent individuated judgment in individual cases.
Yeah, not a blanket.
It was so Orwellian, and I think this is one of the reasons they really eventually stopped using the phrase. It was so Orwellian in the case of Obama because what he imposed was the absence of prosecutorial discretion, right? He said if A, B, and C apply, you will not prosecute. You will not deport if A, B, and C. That's the total absence of prosecutorial discretion, not its fulfillment. We're not.
That it's the exact reverse of both Biden and Trump issuing mass pardons based on categories.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And people ask me about the pardons as well, and this is I think another recent abuse of presidential power. I will say this about pardons, at least, they are constitutionally provided for.
Right.
In
any federal crime. I mean, that's.
Well, I didn't hear that, Jim.
The president can pardon anybody he wants for any federal crime. I mean, that's pretty much.
Right. That's a plenary power in the Constitution. There is no check on that. Except the president's own sense of propriety. That none of the other branches have a check on that. So I will say, at least with respect to pardons, that's in the Constitution explicitly.
I mean, the January 6th pardons have gotten a lot of attention, but people missed or sort of forgot about Biden's mass pardons of everybody who was incarcerated during COVID just before he left office, too.
Yeah, right. And well, I mean, you could do a whole segment, Jim, on the question of pardons. Of course, you have Ford's pardon of Nixon. You have Carter's en masse pardon of Vietnam era deserters, which was one of the first actions he took as president in January of 1977. And Andrew Johnson, the lower ranking members of the Confederate Army. He issued an en masse pardon to them.
So
Uh,
before Biden and Trump, those were the only two examples of the mass pardons in history, right?
yes, yeah, the only two that I know of, right? I can't
Yeah,
think of any others, right? The Civil War and the Vietnam conflict, because it
100
was
years
never
apart,
a declared war.
rather than being 6 months apart or a month apart.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
That's the problem with, and that's my problem with governing by executive, let's say fiat, because it covers executive orders, executive actions, and other terms. Is that even if I agree with the policy, it's still a bad way to do things because it just encourages the next president to do even worse things.
That again is a really, really crucial point. This is the problem with governing by executive fiat, especially in an era where the parties are closely divided in strength. Every 4 years, at most every 8 years, we have a new administration, and this is one of the defining qualities of law. One of the essences of law, which is one of the reasons that we accord it the high respect that we do, is because that it's supposed to sort of inculcate some stability, some settled expectations. And when we rule by executive fiat, we don't get that. Whatever you thought, to take it to the international scene, and Trump has raised this issue, but whatever you thought of the Panama Canal treaties under the Carter administration, they were treaties, right?
Right,
I mean, they were submitted to the Senate, even though President Carter realized that it wasn't a slam dunk, and I think he only had one vote to spare. I think it would ended up 68-32 or something like that to ratify the Panama Canal treaties. But Reagan then could not come along and say, oh, the heck with the Panama Canal treaties, we're out of it, because they were treaties, right? They were done in a constitutional manner. Compare that with the Paris Accords,
or the
right?
Iran.
Obama says we're in, Trump 1 says we're out, Biden says we're in, Trump 2 says we're out, and so forth and so on. Or the Iran nuclear deal, for example. This is not the way to run a fair. And even with respect to DACA, President Trump in his first administration tried to repeal it. I haven't heard of any noises along those lines in the second administration. As it happens, the Supreme Court stayed his hand because they said he didn't go about it in the correct manner.
I'm looking.
But even with respect to like individuals who are relying on policies like this, deferred action for childhood arrivals, you have no predictability because you don't know what the next administration is going to do. This is kind of the way third world countries govern themselves, not the way a constitutional republic ought to, at least in my judgment.
Well, right, and that's the problem with I think pointing out the difference between the United States and other Western democracies is that other countries mostly don't have a ratification step in international agreements the way that we do.
Correct. Yeah, it's whatever the general says, right?
Yeah,
It's what goes.
he's got the majority,
Yeah,
but I
yeah.
mean, they don't have to have it then ratified by 2/3 of Parliament. Just the majority party decides.
Yeah. So when you negotiate with the United States, historically at least, it's not so true anymore. But you knew that was the caveat when you were negotiating. The classic example is the Treaty of Versailles, which President Wilson not only personally negotiated on behalf of the United States, but then tried to drum up support for Senate ratification. He failed. Right? So even though Versailles was supposedly going to be this great triumph for President Wilson, it ended up being a great disaster instead, because you have that additional step in the United States. The United States Senate has to sign on by a supermajority. They didn't in this case. They wouldn't have in the Paris Accords. They wouldn't have in the Iran nuclear agreement, which is basically why they weren't submitted to the Senate to begin with.
In fact, I think the last time, well, recently, we passed treaties letting Finland and Sweden join NATO. But before that, it had been decades since we ratified an actual treaty, I think.
That's right. Yeah, it's not done anymore. We renamed them international executive agreements. And maybe this is what we want, right? Maybe we want a strong man, kind of a superhero type as a president. because political scientists for generations have noted that there's something to be said to have a strong man at the head of your government, right? It's more efficient, at
Right.
least while that person is in power.
The problem with that,
Uh,
as you said, is, and that's probably the whole unitary executive theory that the Trump team seems to be pursuing, is that we still have elections, and
yeah,
the next, 4 years from now, then President Newsom could be doing the exact opposite of everything.
well, yeah, and it could be a President Newsom. You're absolutely right. In fact, if I had to put money on somebody being the Democratic nominee in 28, it would probably be Newsom. So
I'd prefer to
this
be myself.
highlights, I think, some of the founders' wisdom in trying to develop a more stable form of government, and whether some creative lawyer somewhere can make an argument that all of these actions are constitutional. They're certainly in a gray area at best, and they don't really comply with the spirit of the Constitution. It's plainly not what the drafters had in mind. And then you get the arguments with, well, they were writing 2.5 centuries ago, almost.
Yeah,
So why?
it's like the argument that we don't need the electoral college anymore. I mean, no,
Right, right.
fine, get it passed as
Yeah,
get it repealed. Good luck with that.
yeah, exactly. So, you've recently had one law school dean, by the way, a prominent one. I forget his name, Edward Cherninsky or something like that, is one of the deans of the prominent law schools out in California. And he just wrote a book. I'm not recommending the book, especially since I haven't read it. But he just wrote a book. I believe it came out just last year. Maybe it was 2023. It's in the last year or two, in which he advocated tearing up the Constitution and starting over, which I would just say that's essentially what the drafters of our Constitution did, right? They tore up the existing government, the Articles of Confederation in 1787, because they're like, it's not working. So, maybe there's an argument that we just need to tear this stuff up, and strengthen the office of the presidency and get rid of the Constitution. I wouldn't buy that argument, but maybe that's where we're headed. I don't know.
Speaking of books, you've got a book coming out on the Supreme Court, right? You're working on.
Yeah, I do. I do. I don't want to make any promises that it's going to be ready for Christmas.
Oh,
Because
you're
I've been publishing a couple of articles recently on. In fact, I just published a book chapter on the Trump administration's orders and how the Supreme Court dealt with them, talking about the census case,
yeah.
the immigration case, the Muslim ban case, and for the Trump supporters who are mad about me calling it the Muslim ban case, I just do want to point out that President Trump himself used that phrase
That's why I got struck
to
down in the first
describe.
place. So how do you think
It,
the current court is going to look at this unitary executive theory?
I think for the most part, look, you've got a lot of questions that are new, um, or at least relatively new. Stopping spending that has been authorized. I think that the court's probably going to say that's within the executive branch's power. You cannot spend without appropriations by Congress. That's explicitly in the Constitution, right? But can you stop spending that has been appropriated? Well, that's not explicitly within the Constitution.
Wait. So if Congress has said you must spend this money to do this thing, the president can choose not to.
Well, but see, this is the issue. Where does legislation end and where does execution begin? Do you see my point?
Yeah, I mean, I
I,
understand if the Congress says, okay, you have this amount of money for foreign aid,
yeah.
do what you like, and the president can shut down certain programs or grants or whatever. But just saying you have to spend this much on defense or this much on the army, then the president has to spend it, right?
Yeah, I would agree with you, but I don't think that's going to be a slam dunk at the Supreme Court. As I said, and who knows, when that'll get to the court. That's another issue, and how it will come out. But as I say, uh, saying Congress must authorize all spending, it doesn't, which the Constitution does say that, it doesn't follow logically from that the president cannot withhold spending where he sees, as Trump has said, waste, abuse, and fraud. I'm not making that argument. I'm just saying there's an
Because
argument to be
this
made there.
authorizes the spending, they don't require it.
Right. Yes. Well, yeah, okay. So yeah, and the issue is maybe trickier, whereas you posit, Congress says this money must be spent for this item. That's I think a clearer case of congressional power. But there's a lot of murky waters here,
Yeah.
of when legislation, a similar issue is when Congress, and there have actually been court cases that have addressed this issue a lot more clearly, but when Congress tries to grant job protections for certain high-ranking members of the executive branch. The classic case was the independent counsel, who is necessarily a member.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an executive function. It's necessarily a member of the executive branch. Does Congress have the authority to pass a law saying this member of the executive branch is insulated from presidential control? Well, that's problematic. Appropriating money is legislative in nature. Spending it is arguably executive in nature. There's All I'm saying is this: there's a lot that the courts are going to have to work out that really hasn't been worked out before. A lot of these are going to be relatively new legal issues. In fact, all of them, the ones that are before the court right now, the U.S. aid issue, not created by an enabling statute, not created U.S. aid by Congress, although
Was later authorized.
administered under pre-existing statutes and authorized by funding and sort of thing. But if the Trump administration is going to make the argument, Congress didn't even create this agency to begin with. You see, why can't he put a stop to their activities, or the Secretary of State put a stop to their activities?
But then again,
I don't know. Ultimately,
the courts didn't even let him repeal DACA the first time. And now it's just,
no, the Trump administration was stopped from repealing DACA because the court ruled that action was arbitrary and capricious.
right.
Right? Then Attorney General Sessions said, "Oh, it's unconstitutional. DACA is unconstitutional," and so he directed the Secretary of the DHS at the time, the acting Secretary of the DHS, to put a stop to it. The acting Secretary of DHS did. The Supreme Court, in a case, by the way, that took years to wind
Yeah.
its way through the court, and this is an important point, right? The court didn't say you can't do it. They didn't say that. They said you didn't go about it the right way, right? You just said it was unconstitutional. Well, we've never held it was unconstitutional, and they haven't. The case went to the Supreme Court in 2016. They split 4-4 that year because that was after the death of Justice Scalia. So you had an evenly divided court. So the action was arbitrary and capricious. Similarly, the court stopped the Trump administration from asking the citizenship question on the 2020 census. For a similar reason. They actually went one step further in that case. They essentially said the Trump administration lied. This is the first time in American history that I know of, and Justice Thomas made this point in a dissenting opinion, that you had the Supreme Court shout, "You liar," at the President of the United States, because they said the justification for the citizenship question, which was the Justice Department wanted it to enforce the 1965 Voting Rights Act, was made up. It was pretextual, to use their word. So the Trump administration didn't have the Muslim ban, quote unquote, was upheld. The citizenship question was struck down. Their attempt to repeal DACA was struck down. So they didn't have real great success at the Supreme Court, and maybe they've learned some lessons this time around. I think they will kind of dot their I's and cross their T's as far as trying to get these presidential orders sustained at the court. There's wild cards on the Supreme Court. Gorsuch is one, Kavanaugh is one, Barrett is another.
Yeah, Barrett's been,
You know that Thomas and Alito will reliably vote conservative, quote unquote. You know that Kagan and Sotomayor and Jackson will reliably vote liberal. But despite all the media reports you hear about a 6-3 super majority um, uh, of conservatives on the court, Chief Justice Roberts especially is not going to fall in lockstep. And
Well, and
depending on the issue, go ahead.
in fact, the conservative justices generally are less reliably ideological than the liberal justices.
That's absolutely so. I can give you examples of Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, Barrett, Roberts, not Thomas, maybe, but those other four, I can give you examples, even though they're relatively new justices, except for Roberts. I can give you examples of their joining the quote unquote liberals on a divided court, on a question that divided the court. You will never find an example of Kagan or Sotomayor joining the conservatives on a question that divides the Supreme. That just won't happen.
Yeah.
Which is a major frustration for me that the media always portray Republican justices as ideologues. And in fact, the record shows that it's more likely to be Democratic justices. And it's also, by the way, the record shows pretty conclusively that it's more likely to be Republican presidents who appoint centrists to the court than it is Democratic presidents who appoint reliable liberals. The last exception was Justice White, appointed by President Kennedy. That's 1962, right? That's over 60 years ago.
That was the last Supreme Court justice that a Democrat appointed.
Pardon me?
That was the last centrist Supreme Court justice that a Democrat appointed.
Yeah. Look at the appointments since that time. Fortress, Thurgood Marshall, and Jimmy Carter never had an appointment. But then you had Ginsburg and Breyer under Clinton, and then Sotomayor and Kagan under Obama.
Well, yeah. Meanwhile, we
Fortas and Thurgood Marshall.
plenty of Republican appointees who ended up being very centrist. Kennedy,
Blackmun, Stevens, Kennedy, Warren was a Republican. Brennan was a Republican appointment. So the charge that Republican presidents appoint Republican ideologues is laughable on its face. No, Democratic presidents appoint liberal.
But
yeah, right.
I mean, so the question, I guess, overall with the Supreme Court and all these orders and actions are that whether they will take a sweeping approach to ruling on executive authority or just piecemeal it out on technicalities like they did before.
Yeah, and that depends on how persuasive Chief Justice Roberts is, because Chief Justice Roberts, as maybe befits the Chief Justice, I don't know, I think he does, but he'll always try to find middle ground, narrow grounds. The heavy hitters on the conservative side are Thomas. One thing we haven't touched on here that Thomas has been beating the drum about for many, many years, and which I absolutely agree with him on, is this business of injunctions, restraining orders, nationwide injunctions issued by a single federal district court judge out of 400 and some judges.
That's insane.
Thomas has, and the thing is, both Congress, because they create the federal district courts, and the United States Supreme Court would have the power to stop that practice, and neither of them has.
They are starting to rein that in, right?
Pardon me?
They're trying to rein in judge shopping and that sort of behavior, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because right, the point is this: given that the Supreme Court has not been very stringent on this requirement, this judicial requirement for standing, would-be plaintiff can find somebody anywhere in the country with standing because the president wants to do something with a particular program via executive order. So it's called forum shopping, right? All a plaintiff has to do is to find one of 400 and some district court judges that's going to rule her way, and hey, you're good to go. And then it's tied up in litigation, and that's a nonsensical way to run things, right? And Thomas has, I think, quite rightly been beating the drum on that for years. And Justice Alito has joined that parade recently. One of the opinions he wrote last term well, in the last year of the Trump administration, and I forget now which case it was, but he wrote an opinion saying, and I think it was the DACA case. Don't hold me to that, but I believe it was the DACA case, the dissent there. And he said, look, the president, institutes a policy. He's got a 4-year term, and then you have a district court enter an injunction, and then it's in litigation for 4 years, and then it's defeated. This is not the way to run things, right? This is not the way our government is supposed to run, by litigation and executive order. That's kind of the mess we find ourselves in.
Yeah, it's almost as if lawyers are the fourth branch of government balancing out the president now instead of Congress.
Not only lawyers, but public interest plaintiffs and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so that's no way to run a government. And even when it's policies that I agree with, and not coming on the specifics of how I feel about what Trump has done, even when it's policies that I agree with, it should not be done this way. They should be done through Congress, be passing a law, then they should be challenged in the court for years if necessary.
And that's, Jim, that's a very crucial point, right? Because it's always so easy to say, I like this one. Yeah. I like what's happening now. So yeah, let's go. And to forget that, well, as you say, in 4 years, maybe we'll have a President Newsom, and then you won't like it. Right. So,
yes,
so
exactly.
process matters. I mean, that's part of the genius of the Constitution. I mean, we all think we're right about our political positions, right? We all think that anybody who doesn't see it our way has got it wrong. And this is why the legitimacy of the process is so important, and that gets lost. So this business of, well, don't cheer it. The point you just made, don't cheer it on just because you like the result, is a bad and a dangerous approach.
Well, and unfortunately, Congress themselves have encouraged this approach because they've chosen to take themselves out of the process.
Right. The loyalty now, and this is Washington warned about this, right, in his farewell address. The loyalty now is to the party. It's not to the institutions, right? So Democratic senators are not loyal to the Senate as an institution. They're loyal to the Democratic Party. So if there's a Democratic president, well, he's good to go. And you see that now with Republican senators, with the Republicans in charge of the Senate. Most of them, there are exceptions. Normally Susan Collins of Maine is one exception. Mitch McConnell has recently been an exception.
Yeah, I'm glad that actually our Republican senator is more independent-minded than our independent senator. But
yeah, generally, yeah. Well, that's a joke I always make about Maine. I always tell people that in Maine, I say you've got one independent senator and one partisan. The problem is the independent senator wears a partisan label. And the partisan senator claims to be independent.
Of course, the Democrats will just say that she only votes against Republicans when her vote doesn't matter. But
Yeah. Well. Anyway, it would be nice to go back to a time where senators' loyalty was to their own institution, irrespective of who the president was, rather than to their party.
Well, yes, and McConnell did that quite a bit in Trump's first term, but now he's in no position to do that much anymore.
He's not leader anymore. Does, and he's not running for re-election, right? So he's free.
Yeah, but he can't really use the institution to hold back against the president. He
doesn't have the power.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not sure the current leadership. I think John Thune is a good guy, but I'm not sure the current leadership is that interested either.
Yeah. Well, you had a senator from Alabama. I won't name him, but he used to be a famous football coach, who explicitly said when he was asked about voting or not voting for Trump's nominees, he explicitly said, well, it's not my job to tell President Trump that he's made bad appointments. Well, the Constitution says
your job.
What?
It is literally his job. It's in the Constitution.
Yeah, exactly.
And by consent.
That is exactly his job. So it was kind of a startling thing for him to say.
But then again, that's where we are. Often freak out too much about quotes, like J.D. Vance's quote about the courts overruling the president last week. that the courts couldn't overrule the proper use of his authority, somewhere along those.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me say this. I like Vance is in a tough position, right? He unusually among high-ranking members of the federal government today, very unusually, he's a brilliant man. And I mean, he's patently brilliant, and he ends up saying a lot of stupid things uh, because he is vice president. You know,
But
you are constrained.
his basic point, if you take it literally, is right. The courts cannot overrule the president's legitimate use of his authority. The question is where that lies.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so it's a classic question of question begging, right? Well, sorry, you can't overrule the legitimate authority. Well, the whole question is, what is his legitimate authority?
Right.
That's a question that's going to assume new relevance after the presidential immunity case. You know, because there the court has that tripartite division of core constitutional responsibilities, presidential powers that are not core constitutional responsibilities, and then individual actions on the part of the president. And I don't know that they're always going to divide neatly into one of those three categories.
Well, right, like
So
the
we'll
like the election interference,
Right. Exactly. Does not divide nicely into one of those three categories. This is a great time. I teach administrative law, and this is just it's a really as an American, it saddens me a little. As a political scientist, I'm like that specializes in administrative law. I'm kind of like, wow, this is the field to be teaching now because it's so fast developing and there's so many new issues to be talking about. So we'll never be bored studying this.
Yeah, and that's why, frankly, I haven't written about it a lot on either my Substack or on my column, is just because everything is happening so quickly, it's impossible to.
Right. Yeah. Whatever you write becomes stale, maybe within a week, depending on the latest court ruling.
Oh, I could do a whole, 1,000-word blog post and post it that day, and it could be overruled by tomorrow.
That's exactly right. Yeah, try teaching it. Yeah, it's exactly true.
I mean, trying to explain how, because I barely understand myself, how they rescinded the memo but not the executive order on the funding freeze in a 700
yeah.
doesn't work.
Yeah, I'm not sure I completely understand that either. Yeah.
But any final thoughts, Doug, or points you want to make?
Well, every once in a while, I think it would be a good idea to have young people go back and read the Constitution and maybe a little bit of the debates at the Constitutional Convention and some of the crucial Federalist Papers and kind of soak up a little of that wisdom. I'm not saying that we can just sort of transport what they thought in the 18th century to today, but there's a lot of lessons that are still relevant, some of which we talked about here that I think we've forgotten. And I just find it a pity I run across very few Americans who know what's in the Constitution or what the Constitutional Convention was about, and I guess I'm calling for greater civic awareness in that sense.
I completely agree, and I think not only with the attention paid to the president versus Congress and the judicial branch, but also the president versus the school board and the state legislature and the mayor. I mean, oftentimes your school board has just as much impact on your life day to day as anything.
That's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Because they're the ones who set your property tax levels and decide whether you can open a business or not.
Yeah. Policy, politics, they affect all of us in our daily lives, and if we just cede the field to others who take an interest, then we're just bound by what they do. So I always tell my students, get involved. I think it's important.
Get involved,
but do so.
Pay attention. Not just the
president. Yeah. Do so in an informed way. Right? Know what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
That's the other part of that lesson.
Exactly, and that's what I'm trying to do a little bit here and there.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I do.
Thanks, Doug. And thanks for doing this with me again. I'll get it edited and show you the video later.
All right. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Doug. Have a good night. Good to see you.
All right. Good night.